Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I just kind of want to talk about Ender's Saga, specifically the books Ender's Game through Children of the Mind, the first 4 books of the series, because at this point Ender's Saga has really expanded to include like the pre-war books and the Shadow series and all kinds of crazy shit. But originally it was just 4 books, and it went from Ender's Game to Children of the Mind. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's video, the original run. And this is an interesting one because the most popular book by far is Ender's Game, which is in here somewhere. Oh, by the way, ignore the fact that there's only 3 books sitting here because for some reason I've been looking for a hard copy, like a physical copy of Speaker for the Dead for like 2 years, and I can't find it anywhere. It's nuts. Anyway, the most popular one seems to be Ender's Game. And it's funny because that's the one that isn't even the point of him writing this series. That's the one that he kind of felt obligated to write just so he had a jumping off point so that he could get into having the types of conversations that he really was interested in having. This isn't the conversation he wanted to have. The rest of this is, which is why it's just fascinating to me that that's everybody's favorite. And, you know, the stuff that he wanted to talk about aren't the ones that ended up becoming popular. But in all honesty, to be fair, Ender's Game is a very good book. It is extremely well written. It's fast, it's short, it's tight, it's action-packed, it has good characters, it has a good plot, it has a good message, a good moral. It's a very good book in its own right, even if it's not the one that's maybe having those advanced scientific style conversations. And to be fair, that might be a point in its favor because it completely avoids all of those thought experiment conversations that sometimes come along with science fiction, making it easier to read, easier to digest for the normal everyday reader. Because books that really heavily lean into the theoretical, love them or hate them, can be polarizing. And to be fair, science fiction is that genre where historically it has been that genre where you could go, if this were to happen or if this were to exist, where would that take us? Theoretically, what would happen there? And then you can meditate on the repercussions of it or the morality of it, etc., etc. But like I said, those can be polarizing, especially now in a day and age where science fiction is becoming far less about thought experiments. Think like the Dune series, especially the God Emperor of Dune in that series. And it's starting to become much more of just action space operas. Think The Expanse. You know, it's not what it used to be back when it was considered classic sci-fi. But anyway, back to Ender's Saga. This saga as a whole is pretty damn good. And like I said, Ender's Game is pretty much the most straightforward of all the books as far as just narrative and messaging is concerned. But all the rest of them are pretty great too. And to the point where I'm surprised that they're not talked about more than they are. So let's just go ahead and get into this. And just FYI right up front, spoilers ahead for the entire series of Ender's Game or the Ender's Saga. So duck out now if you haven't read it and go read it and then come on back later because it really is worth a read, in my opinion. Ender's Game ends with Ender killing an entire race of creatures, essentially erasing them from the entire universe. Against his will, might I add. And in the aftermath of all of this, the only person who seems to care is Ender. So he at this point becomes the speaker for the dead, and he speaks for the buggers, essentially reframing the public perception of them, and at the same time, reframing the public perception of himself, turning him essentially into the Zenocide, the person who killed an entire race of people. This ultimately leads to the next book, which is The Speaker for the Dead. And in this book, now he did eventually at the end of the last book find one remaining hive queen in hibernation. And now he's going to go searching the entire universe for thousands of years through time dilation. So by this point, he's in his 30s and looks for a new home to allow her to repopulate and kind of grow back the buggers population, the one that he decimated. And all while doing this, he continues to go throughout the galaxy, continuing to function as the speaker for the dead. And this basically just takes somebody who has passed and reframes their life and restructures it and kind of repaints them and the circumstances under which they lived in a more positive light normally, or at the very least a more understandable light. As far as I can tell, it kind of takes their life and makes it a little bit more neutral. Less of a positive or negative lean to anything. What actually happened and what actually caused them to be the way that they were. Which is why when he spoke for the buggers, they became less evil. And when he included himself in there, he becomes less heroic. Anyway, this leads us to a potential planet with a whole new race of creatures and humans living together. And Orson is doing a whole lot with these books. He's going to give you a new race that essentially brutally murders its own people in order to honor them and guide them to their third life. And Ender's going to have to speak the death of a man that everybody universally despises. He has been a pretty terrible person his entire life. He's been abusive towards his wife and his children, and he's just been, as far as anyone is aware of, the absolute worst person ever. And when Ender speaks his death and presents him in a much more understandable and relatable way, it's pretty upsetting to the community. And like I said earlier, this is really a series of books about ideas rather than the plot. Not that the plot is bad, because the plot is quite good, entertaining and engaging throughout. But really, here we're already starting to see the ideas that he really wants to discuss. What is a good person? What makes a good person good? And what makes a bad person bad? And what if that bad person who's done all those bad things had circumstances in their life that added up and led to them doing what they did? Does that give them an excuse to do what they did? Does that excuse the bad and horrible things that they did in their life? Or at the very least, does it help us understand why they were the way that they were? Maybe not excusing them, maybe not making everything all right and warm and fuzzy, but at the very least shedding a light on what made them who they were, and maybe we shouldn't hate them as deeply as we do. Because let's be honest, if there is that much hate, and that much hate runs that deep because they wronged somebody or you, and then that hate is just going to turn around and poison something else, or nothing good. I guess what I'm saying is nothing good is ever going to happen from that cycle. So at the very least, this is a release of some of the tension and of some of the negativity that's surrounding the life that was this other person. And then transitioning back to just the bigger, grander ideas that he's going to want to have in the conversations that he's going to want to have in this book, he comes along with an AI that he has basically become friends with over a couple thousand years. And this AI is going to have all of its own implications brought along with it. What is it? What can it do? What can it entail? Where did it even come from? Because it seems to have just popped up out of the interconnected computer networks that the humans have created that span the entire universe. Also, we have the three different civilizations now living on one planet: the humans, the buggers, and the pequeños. And they're all going to have to figure out, they all have a very different way of living, they all have a very different way of thinking, a very different way of existing. And now we're going to have to figure out how to coexist with the three different types of creatures, the three different life cycles, the three different ideologies, and all of that. And it's really all just to create all of these different thought experiments that we get to have throughout the course of these 4 books. And that is kind of the point, all of these thought experiments, and I keep coming back to that, because to be honest, if it wasn't for this being a setup for those thought experiments to happen, this would be a really dumb idea. Like, Ender, as a person, is going out into the universe, and he's going to try and find a new home for the Hive Queen so that she can rebuild her population. You would find an appropriate planet for her and her, life cycle or whatever, and you would hopefully find an abandoned one, and you'd give it to her, and you'd move on. You would not go to a planet where there were already 2 life forms living there, struggling to coexist at all. Their negotiations and their ability to get along is literally hanging by a thread. And you're going to be like, oh yeah, this looks like the best place to introduce a 3rd species because that'll go over great, won't it? I would hope, if this was like not a fictional story and a real life person, I would hope Ender wasn't that stupid. But all of that aside, that is all forgivable, in my opinion, because of that is really just a premise. And the premise, a little bit unbelievable, is okay, because what it does is it opens the door, and it opens that door for all of these other conversations that we get to have as the books go on. Anyway, in Speaker for the Dead, we find out that not only are all of these creatures living on the same planet, but this planet also has the Descolata, which is a virus that if this virus were ever to get off of this planet, it would destroy all life in the entire universe. And this is going to set us up for the next 2 books, which is Zenocide and the Children of the Mind. And in those 2 books, we really have to navigate exactly how we're going to solve this problem. How are we going to get these 3 life forms to get along and coexist? How are we also going to maintain the Descolata and not allow it to escape? Also, back on home base planet Earth, or at least with the human government off in the main part of the universe, they realize what's happening, and they realize they have a very easy solution. Blow up the damn planet and everybody on it and the Descolata. Problem solved. So now it's a race for survival. But whose survival, who's worthy, who deserves it, and why? And now Ender also has to realize and come to terms with, if the humans are correct, if he cannot get the Pequeninos and the Buggers on board to understand, they will wipe everything out. And if he cannot get them on board with the idea of maintaining the Descolata, he might have to let them all be destroyed for the greater good, essentially allowing him to take part in another Zenocide, this time multiple Zenocides. And this is something that he has worked his entire life to get away from. He's done this once, and he's paid repercussions and reparations for his entire life just trying to fix having done this once, and he might have to be complicit in it happening again. And he wrestles with these ideas as the books go on. And then at one point in the books, it gets really wild when we introduce the idea of there is a space outside of normal space, which is infinite and all expansive, but it doesn't consist of any time or any space at all. It's also the space where essentially the core of someone's being, like their soul or their spirit or the divine force that is their self, all of these exist in this space outside of space and outside of time. And then we use this space to explain the fact that within our universe it is physically impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. But if for some reason you were able to transfer to the space outside of space, you could then re-enter normal space anywhere you wanted to. The only trick is you would need a mind large enough of holding the mental image of everything and everyone that you're transporting in its mind out of and back into space without losing track of anything. Enter Jane, the artificial intelligence that consists of the entire human network that spans all of the universe. This then doesn't even move the person from one point in space to another point in space. It actually just recreates a new version of them while the old one basically disintegrates, and it moves that Iowa or whatever it's called, the soul, the spirit, that life force from one body to the next. So essentially the body that you did have disappears and crumbles, and a new body is created, which then creates a whole series of conversations of what is life, who are we as people, are we our body, are we our soul, or that life force, or whatever it is that's being transferred from one body to the next as they are being recreated or new ones are being created. And at one point, Ender even has to control multiple bodies with one soul or life force, and it starts to kill all of them because it is not capable of sustaining more than one body at a time. It is nuts. Also, in all of this, we really haven't even discussed the idea of moving through space at faster than light travel, which is one of the more interesting ways of faster than light travel that I've actually read about. And once again, I don't ever really hear it discussed. It's just one of those things where it's like, I feel like these should be talked about more in what he was doing, and at least the ideas or the thoughts that he was having. There's a lot of things talked about on booktube, and this isn't one of them. Like I said, Ender's Game is. Everybody wants to talk about Ender's Game, but nobody wants to talk about the rest of them. And I'm not entirely sure why, because some of this, some of it stretches the ideas of plausibility, some of it stretches the ideas of believability, and some of it, I think maybe in this day and age, we're leaning a little bit more into the hard science fiction. What can we actually prove? What's based on actual theory? And I don't think that's what he was doing over here. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's because he was like, you know what? Let's just think about some crazy shit. Like, what happens if one soul tries to, embody multiple bodies at a time? Would they all die? Maybe we're more into the 3-body problem right now and less of the 3-body problem, if you know what I mean. Wow. Anyway, I'm just really scratching the surface of all of the things that get discussed and brought up, and he really wanted to discuss in these books. And I also want to acknowledge the balancing act that he's doing in these books, because he's really balancing a tight narrative with stakes and tension and drama, and how are we going to solve all these problems and race against the clock, also while just having page after page of dialogue on different thought experiments. And if the scale were to tip one way or the other, I think it would lean a little bit heavier into the page after page of thought experiment dialogue, and a little bit less into the tension and the drama and the stakes. But then again, that was the whole reason that he wrote these books, was so that he could have those conversations. So if he leans a little bit heavier into them than he does into the action and the stakes, so be it. Which is also another reason why I kind of feel bad that Ender's Game is like the most talked about of all the books, because really that's just the one that he wrote so he could have the conversations that he was interested in having. And everybody basically said, we're not interested in what you're interested in, Orson. But then again, he doesn't seem like he's having any problem selling books. Anyway, everybody, as always, the link for my Patreon's in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.